Have you ever wondered what it felt like to watch the sky darken with the knowledge that survival depended entirely on what you did in the next few hours? Can you imagine a world where a single, overlooked task, a crack left unsealed, a bucket of water forgotten outside, could mean the difference between warmth and freezing darkness? Tonight, we journey to the Siberian frontier of the 18th and 19th centuries, to those isolated settlements where winter storms didn't merely inconvenience, they tested the very will to endure. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on these early peoples, I'd like to ask a small kindness. Please tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night passages through forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you. Leave a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is in your part of the world. Some of you may be wrapped in the stillness of deep night, others greeting the first light of morning, or somewhere in the gentle space between. Now dim your lights if you can, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle together into tonight's quiet exploration of preparation, patience, and the human instinct to protect what matters most. We begin not with the storm itself, but with the moments before, the heavy silence, the changed light, the careful work of those who understood that winter offered no second chances. You wake before dawn to a silence that feels different. The usual sounds, the distant crack of ice on the river, the soft shuffle of animals stirring in their shelter, the whisper of wind through pine branches, have all gone still. This is not the peaceful quiet of a calm winter morning. This is the silence that comes before. You push aside the heavy fur that serves as your blanket and feel the cold air of the cabin touch your face like a warning. Your breath clouds immediately in the dim light filtering through the small ice-crusted window. The floor beneath your feet is earth-packed hard as stone by months of freezing temperatures. You pull on layers, undergarments made of coarse wool, a long tunic of thick homespun cloth, trousers reinforced at the knees with leather patches sewn by your own hands during the endless dark evenings of the previous winter. Your fingers are already stiff, and you haven't even stepped outside yet. You flex them, willing warmth into the joints, knowing you'll need every bit of dexterity for what lies ahead. The cabin around you is small, perhaps 4 paces wide and 6 paces long. Its walls are logs chinked with moss and clay, some of which has crumbled away over the months, leaving thin gaps that admit needles of frigid air. The ceiling is low enough that you must duck slightly near the corners. Overhead, thick beams groan occasionally under the weight of snow that has accumulated since the last storm 3 weeks ago. You move to the hearth where last night's fire has burned down to a bed of coals glowing faintly orange in the gloom. Kneeling, you add kindling, thin strips of birch bark you collected months ago and dried near the fire, knowing that winter preparation begins long before winter arrives. The bark catches quickly, curling and blackening, releasing a scent both sweet and acrid. You add larger pieces, building the fire with practiced efficiency, not too fast, or the flames will consume the fuel too quickly, not too slow, or the cold will deepen its grip on the room. Around you, your family begins to stir. Your wife sits up slowly, pulling the sleeping furs around her shoulders. She doesn't speak yet. There's no need. You've both lived through enough winters to recognize the quality of this silence, the weight of the air, the way the light through the window has taken on a pale, metallic cast. Your children, 3 of them, ranging from 5 to 12 winters old, remain curled together in the sleeping alcove built into the wall. You let them rest a little longer. They'll need their strength soon enough. For now, the work falls to you and your wife, as it always has, as it always will. You move to the door, which is made of rough-hewn planks bound together with iron straps salvaged from a broken wagon wheel years ago. Before opening it, you pause, steeling yourself. Then you lift the wooden beam that bars it shut, set it aside, and pull. The door resists. Ice has formed along its edges overnight, but yields with a groan that seems too loud in the stillness. The cold that rushes in is immediate and profound. It's not the sharp, biting cold of a clear winter day, but something heavier, denser, as if the air itself has thickened. You step outside onto snow that comes up past your knees. The sky above is a uniform grey, but not the soft grey of ordinary overcast weather. This grey is low, pressing down, and it seems to have layers, lighter near the horizon, darker overhead, all of it motionless. There's no wind at all, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing. In winter, there's always wind on this frontier, howling across the endless white plains, rattling through the skeletal branches of birch and pine. But now, nothing moves. The settlement around you is a small cluster of cabins much like your own, perhaps a dozen in total, scattered across a clearing carved from the taiga forest. Smoke rises from a few chimneys in thin, straight columns that climb toward the grey ceiling of cloud and then seem to flatten out, spreading horizontally as if afraid to rise any higher. In the distance, the forest stands dark and dense, a wall of conifers so thick you cannot see more than a few trees deep. That forest stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, broken only by frozen rivers and the occasional settlement like this one, each separated by days or weeks of travel through snow and cold. You are isolated here, profoundly so. If something goes wrong, if the storm brings more snow than your roof can bear, if your firewood runs out, if someone falls ill, there's no help coming. The nearest town is 4 days' journey by sleigh, in good weather, and good weather is no longer what you have. You scan the horizon, looking for any sign of change. The light is strange, almost luminous despite the heavy clouds, as if the snow on the ground is reflecting what little daylight penetrates from above, bouncing it back and forth until everything seems to glow with a faint, cold radiance. Movement catches your eye, a raven black against the grey, flying low and fast toward the forest. It disappears into the trees without a sound. Even the birds know they've already taken shelter. You turn your attention to the work at hand. First, the animals. They depend on you completely, and in return, they provide milk, eggs, warmth, and if necessary, food. The animal shelter is attached to the side of your cabin, accessible through an interior door that helps keep some of their body heat flowing into your living space. It's a practical arrangement born of necessity. In winter, animals and humans need each other to survive. You push open the connecting door and step into the dim, close space that smells of hay, dung, and the warm, slightly sour scent of animal bodies. Your horse, a sturdy mare with a thick winter coat, turns her head toward you. Her ears are pinned back slightly, and she stamps one hoof, a nervous gesture you've learned to read. Animals sense storms before humans do, some instinct in their blood alerting them to changes in air pressure, shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, or signals we've long forgotten how to perceive. You speak to her softly, running your hand along her neck. Her coat is rough and thick, matted in places with dried mud and old sweat. Beside her, the 2 goats huddle together, their yellow eyes watching you with that unsettling, horizontal pupilled stare. They're quiet now, but earlier you heard them bleating insistently, a sound that means only one thing. They're afraid. The chickens are in a wooden coop built into the corner, and they've gone completely silent. This morning, there was the usual clucking and rustling as they woke and began their endless search for food, but now they sit motionless on their roosts, feathers fluffed, small heads tucked down. You check their nesting boxes and find 3 eggs still faintly warm. You pocket them carefully, food that might matter in the days ahead. Your wife appears in the doorway with a wooden bucket. Together you begin the work of preparing the animals for what's coming. First, the bedding. You fork down thick layers of hay from the small loft above the stalls, spreading it deep on the floor. The more bedding, the more insulation from the frozen ground below. The animals will burrow into it and their body heat will be trapped in the straw, creating a pocket of relative warmth. You add dried leaves and pine needles scavenged from the forest floor before the first snows came, mixing them into the hay to add bulk and help absorb moisture. Water is next. You carry the bucket to the trough, a hollowed log that has frozen solid overnight, its surface a smooth sheet of ice. Using an iron bar heated in the cabin's fire, you melt through the ice, breaking it into chunks that you lift out and toss aside. Then you pour fresh water from the bucket, knowing it too will freeze within hours once the storm arrives and the temperature plummets even further. You give the animals extra feed, oats for the horse, a mixture of grain and vegetable scraps for the goats, handfuls of seeds scattered for the chickens. They'll need the energy to maintain their body heat through the long hours of the storm. The horse eats eagerly, her nervousness momentarily overcome by hunger. The goats are more hesitant, nibbling cautiously, their ears swiveling at every small sound. You check the walls of the shelter for gaps. There are always gaps. The logs settle over time, the chinking dries and crumbles, and wind finds every weakness. With your wife's help, you stuff fresh moss into the cracks, pressing it deep with a wooden stick until it's firmly lodged. You mix clay with water warmed by the fire, creating a thick paste that you smear over the moss, sealing it in place. Your hands ache from the cold, even though you're working quickly. The clay is gritty and grey, and it sticks under your fingernails, but you don't stop. Every gap sealed is a degree of warmth preserved, a small victory against the storm that's coming. You can feel it now, not just in the silence and the strange light, but in your sinuses, a subtle pressure that builds behind your eyes and makes your teeth ache slightly. This is knowledge passed down from those who lived here before you, the Evenki people who've moved through these forests for countless generations. They taught you to read the signs that the land itself provides, the way snow crystals catch light differently when a storm approaches, the behavior of certain birds, the feel of the air against your skin. You learn to listen for distant sounds in the forest, the crack of branches laden with too much snow, the groan of ice on the river shifting under its own weight. These sounds carry differently when a storm is near, muffled or amplified in ways that speak to those who've learned the language. Your wife finishes sealing the last gap and stands, pressing both hands to the small of her back. She's tired, you both are, but there's no time to rest. You secure the interior door to the animal shelter, making sure it's latched firmly but not barred. If something goes wrong during the storm, you need to be able to reach the animals quickly. Back in the main cabin, your children are awake now. Your eldest, a girl of 12, is already dressed and helping the younger ones with their layers. She's competent beyond her years, shaped by the same harsh necessities that shaped you. Your middle child, a boy of 8, watches you with wide eyes, sensing the urgency but not yet understanding its full weight. The youngest, a girl of 5, clings to her older sister's hand. You kneel beside them and speak gently, explaining what needs to be done. They'll stay inside, helping their mother with indoor preparations while you handle the heavier work outside. Your eldest nods seriously, absorbing the responsibility. You pull on your outer layers, a long coat made of sheepskin, the wool turned inward for warmth, the leather exterior stiff with cold and age. Over that, a heavy cloak woven from the thickest wool, treated with fat to make it water-resistant. On your head, a fur cap with ear flaps that tie under your chin. On your hands, mittens made from rabbit fur sewn inside leather shells. On your feet, boots of felt pressed so thick they add inches to your height, wrapped with leather strips to keep them from falling apart. These boots are perhaps your most valuable possession after your horse. Without them, you couldn't survive 10 minutes in a winter storm. You step outside again into that oppressive silence. The cold finds its way through all your layers eventually, seeping in at the wrists, the neck, the gap between your coat and your belt. The work ahead is simple but exhausting. You must prepare your cabin to withstand wind and snow that will try to tear it apart, bury it, or infiltrate every crack and seam to steal away the precious warmth inside. You begin with the roof. Using a ladder made of poles lashed together with leather thongs, you climb carefully to where the sloped roof meets the wall. The snow up here is deep, piled in drifts that obscure the original line of the roof. You carry a wide wooden shovel, more of a pusher than a true shovel, and begin clearing the snow. It's heavy, wet at the bottom layer where it's been compressed, dry and powdery at the top. You push it over the edge where it falls to the ground in soft explosions of white. This is necessary because snow has weight, far more than most people realize. A roof loaded with too much snow can collapse inward, and if that happens during a storm when the wind is howling and the temperature has dropped to depths that freeze exposed skin in minutes, there's no easy repair. You've heard stories, everyone has, of families found in spring when the thaw comes, crushed under the fallen beams of their own homes. You push another load of snow over the edge. Your arms and shoulders burn with the effort, and sweat begins to form on your back despite the cold. You work systematically, section by section, clearing the accumulated weight. While you're up here, you inspect the roof itself. The thick logs that form the frame are sound, but you notice a small gap where two beams meet, a place where the wind might pry during the storm. You climb down, retrieve a wooden wedge and a mallet from your small collection of tools, and climb back up to drive the wedge into the gap until it's tight. It's a small thing, but small things accumulate into survival or disaster. Next, you check the chimney. It's built of stones mortared together with clay, rising just high enough above the roofline to draw properly. Ice has formed around the opening, and you carefully chip it away with a knife, ensuring the smoke from your fire will have an unobstructed path. A blocked chimney means smoke filling your cabin, and smoke means you can't keep the fire burning, and without fire you will freeze. You descend the ladder and move to the walls of the cabin. Here, the work is similar to what you did inside the animal shelter, finding gaps, packing them with moss, sealing them with clay. But there's an additional step for the outer walls. You shovel snow, great mounds of it, against the base of the cabin, packing it firmly, building it up until it forms a sloping barrier perhaps 3 feet high. This seems counterintuitive, insulating your home with the very thing you're trying to keep out. But snow, when packed, is an excellent insulator. It traps air in countless tiny pockets, and that still air blocks the transfer of heat far more effectively than wood or clay alone. The Evenki taught your people this, showing you how to build snow walls, snow shelters, even entire snow houses when necessary. You pack the snow with your shovel, then with your hands when you need finer control, pressing it firm, smoothing the surface. Your wife appears with old furs, scraps and pieces too worn for clothing, but still useful. Together you hang these over the door and the window, securing them with wooden pegs driven between the logs. The door is the weakest point in any cabin, the place where wind will force its way through no matter how well it's built. The furs add another layer of protection, and they can be pulled aside during the day when you need light, then dropped back into place when darkness falls. The window is small, just a gap covered with a scraped hide, stretched thin enough to let light through. In summer, you remove this hide to let in air and sun, but in winter, it stays in place And now you cover it with fur as well, cutting off even more light, but keeping out the cold. You step back to survey your work. The cabin looks half buried now, hunched down under its layers of snow and fur, bracing itself. It looks ready. But are you? You turn your attention to firewood. This is perhaps the most critical resource, more important even than food, because without heat, you'll die long before hunger becomes a serious threat. Your woodpile is stacked against the east side of the cabin, where it's somewhat protected from the prevailing winds. You've been building this pile since summer, cutting dead trees from the forest, splitting the logs, stacking them to dry. Now you begin moving wood inside. You carry it in armloads, 5 or 6 pieces at a time, stacking it along the back wall of the cabin where it will stay dry and be easily accessible. The wood is heavy and the cold makes it feel heavier. Each trip requires wading through knee-deep snow, bending to gather the wood, straightening while balancing the load, then shuffling carefully back to the door without dropping any pieces or falling. Your back begins to ache, your shoulders burn, you keep moving. Your wife joins you, carrying smaller loads, and together you transfer what you estimate to be 3 days' worth of wood into the cabin. 3 days is a guess, of course. The storm might last 1 day or 5. You might need to burn the wood sparingly, letting the fire die down to coals between feedings, or you might need to keep it roaring constantly if the temperature drops to the depths, where breath freezes and frost forms on the interior walls. You bring in more wood, erring on the side of caution. The cabin is growing crowded now, filled with firewood, extra hay for the animals, containers of water, tools brought in from outside, and your family huddled in the diminishing space. It smells of smoke, damp wool, animal musk, and human bodies. Not pleasant, but familiar, the smell of winter survival. You sort the firewood by type. The birch will burn hot and fast, good for getting a fire roaring quickly. The pine will catch easily and produce a lot of light, but won't burn as long. The thick logs of larch and fir will burn slowly and steadily, holding heat through the long hours of darkness. Near the hearth, you arrange kindling in a small basket, thin strips of bark, dried moss, splinters of resinous wood that will catch from a single spark. You check your fire-starting materials, a piece of flint, a steel striker, a bundle of charcloth made by charring scraps of linen in a sealed tin. These are precious items, and you keep them in a leather pouch that hangs from your belt at all times. Losing them could mean death. Your wife has been working on food preparation. She fills every container you own with water drawn from the well before it becomes inaccessible under snowdrifts, wooden buckets, clay pots, even hollowed-out gourds. Water that's inside will freeze too eventually if the fire goes out, but it can be thawed. Water outside will be buried under snow and impossible to reach. She brings in a bag of grain, dried fish hung from the rafters, a cloth sack of root vegetables stored in the small cold cellar dug beneath the cabin floor. These vegetables, turnips, beets, carrots, are wrinkled and soft, their flavor concentrated and earthy, but they're food, and they'll last. She sets a pot on the fire, adding water, barley, a piece of dried meat, and a handful of the root vegetables. The smell of cooking begins to fill the cabin, a comforting scent that momentarily pushes back the anxiety of preparation. You move outside one more time to check the settlement. Other families are engaged in similar work, shoving snow, carrying wood, securing doors and windows. Smoke rises from every chimney now, those straight vertical columns that still unsettle you with their stillness. You catch the eye of your nearest neighbor, an older man who's lived through more winters than you can count. He nods once, slowly. No words are needed. You both know what's coming. You both know what must be done. A dog barks somewhere, a sharp sound that echoes strangely in the heavy air, and then cuts off abruptly. You haven't heard any dogs since then. They've all retreated to whatever shelter they can find, curling themselves into tight balls, waiting. The light is fading now, though it's barely midday. The grey above has deepened to something darker, and you notice the first change in the air. A faint stirring, not quite wind yet, just the suggestion of movement, a slight shift in the pressure against your face. It's beginning. You hurry back to your cabin. Inside, your family has gathered near the fire. The eldest child is mending a tear in a blanket, her needle moving with practiced precision. The middle child is arranging wooden toys he carved last winter, and the youngest is already drowsy, leaning against her mother. The pot bubbles gently, releasing steam that condenses on the cold walls and runs down in tiny rivulets. You bar the door, sliding the heavy wooden beam into its brackets. This door will not open again until the storm passes, no matter what happens outside. You check the fire one more time, adding a thick log that will burn for hours. You position the iron poker and wooden logs nearby so you can tend the fire without getting up more than necessary. You pull off your outer layers, the sheepskin coat, the wool cloak, the heavy boots, and hang them on pegs near the door, where they'll dry slightly in the cabin's warmth. Your undergarments are damp with sweat from the work, and now that you've stopped moving, the cold begins to seep into your bones. You join your family near the fire, accepting a wooden bowl of hot stew from your wife. The food is simple but good. The grains have softened, the meat has given up its flavor to the broth, and the vegetables add a slight sweetness. You eat slowly, letting the warmth spread through your chest. Around you, your family eats in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle scrape of wooden spoons against bowls. And then you hear it. The wind. It starts as a whisper, a soft rush of air sliding past the cabin walls. Within moments, it builds to a moan, then a howl, then a shriek that sounds almost human. The cabin trembles slightly. Snow begins to hit the walls, not falling gently, but driven horizontally by wind that has gone from still to violent in the span of a few breaths. The storm has arrived. You sit by the fire, your family close around you, and you listen. The wind screams. Snow hammers the door, the walls, the roof, with a sound like fists pounding. The lantern hanging from a ceiling beam sways slightly, its flame flickering, casting dancing shadows across the cramped space. Outside, the world has become chaos. Wind and snow and darkness all mixed together into something primal and fierce. But inside, for now, you're safe. You've done everything you can. You've sealed every gap, gathered every resource, made every preparation that experience and instinct demanded. Now comes the hardest part, the waiting, the long hours or days of listening to the storm rage, hoping your preparations were enough, hoping the roof holds, hoping the fire doesn't go out, hoping morning will come and bring with it a return to the eerie silence that means the storm has passed. Your youngest child stirs and whimpers softly, frightened by the noise. Your wife pulls the child close, wrapping her in furs, murmuring soft reassurances. The middle child stares at the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Your eldest sits straight-backed, her face composed, but you see her hands gripping the blanket she was mending, knuckles white. You add another log to the fire. The flames leap higher, pushing back the shadows, and in that small circle of light and warmth, your family huddles together. The storm will do what storms do. You can only wait, tend the fire, and hope that when the wind finally dies and the snow stops falling, you'll be able to open that door and step out into a world transformed but still survivable. The hours stretch ahead, measured only by the need to feed the fire, to shift position when your muscles grow stiff, to offer quiet comfort when fear rises in the darkness. This is what winter demands of those who choose to live on the frontier. Not just strength or courage, but patience, endurance, and the ability to sit in uncertainty while the world outside rages beyond your control. Let us drift now from this single cabin, this single family waiting in the firelight, and turn our attention to another life unfolding in this same frontier world. Her name was Marta Ivashkina, and though you would not find her story written in the official records of the empire, her presence shaped the survival of those who lived beside her in ways both subtle and profound. She was born in the autumn of 1789 in a settlement much like the one we've just left, where wooden cabins huddled together against the immensity of the Siberian wilderness. Her father had been a trapper, drawn east by rumors of rich fur territories, and her mother came from a family of exiles, minor nobility who defended someone powerful enough to send them into Siberia's vast embrace. Marta grew up between two worlds, neither quite belonging to one nor the other, yet drawing strength from both in equal measure. From her father, she learned the practical knowledge of survival, how to read animal tracks in snow, how to judge the quality of pelts, how to move through forests in winter without exhausting yourself. From her mother, she inherited a different kind of knowledge, literacy, which was rare on the frontier, and a quiet determination that nobility was defined not by birth, but by how one conducted oneself in the face of hardship. Her mother would sit with her in the evenings, teaching her to read by the light of tallow candles, speaking of a world beyond the forest where books filled entire rooms and conversations ranged across philosophy and poetry. But it was from her grandfather, an Evenki elder who sometimes visited their settlement to trade, that Marta learned what would become her most valuable skill, the ability to read storms before they arrived. This was not fortune-telling or mysticism, though some settlers would later call it that, but rather a sophisticated understanding of natural signs built over generations of close observation. The old man appeared each winter, materializing from the forest with a bundle of furs and a small sled pulled by dogs whose eyes seemed to hold the same knowing quality as their masters. He spoke Russian haltingly, mixing it with his own language, and most of the settlers found his presence unsettling, his face weathered to the texture of old leather, his eyes holding a distance that suggested he saw things others couldn't. But Marta, even as a small child, was drawn to him with an intensity that puzzled her parents. She would sit quietly while he worked, watching as he repaired snowshoes or carved small figurines from pieces of wood, her young eyes tracking every movement of his gnarled hands. And he, perhaps recognizing something in her attention, a quality of focus that went beyond childish curiosity, began to teach her. He taught her to feel changes in air pressure through the ache in her sinuses and joints, explaining in his broken Russian how the body itself became an instrument for reading the sky's intentions. He taught her to watch how smoke rose from chimneys and how quickly frost formed on metal surfaces left outside, demonstrating how these simple observations could reveal the invisible movements of air masses and approaching weather systems. He taught her the behavior of animals before storms, how horses would refuse to settle, how dogs would become either agitated or eerily calm, how birds would fall silent in a way that felt different from their usual evening quiet. He taught her to listen to the forest itself, standing with her at the edge of the settlement in the deep cold of winter afternoons. Trees make sounds as they prepare for storms, he explained. Subtle creaks and groans as the wood contracts in dropping temperatures, small cracks as ice forms in crevices. The river ice speaks too, he said, shifting and settling in response to pressure changes in the air above, its voice carrying across the frozen landscape like a conversation in a language most people had forgotten how to understand. These sounds carry differently depending on what's coming. Short, sharp reports mean brief cold. Long, rolling groans mean sustained storms. Marta absorbed all of this with the seriousness of a child who understands instinctively that she's being given something precious, something that could not be found in books or learned in classrooms. By the time she reached her teenage years, she could predict storms with an accuracy that occasionally unnerved her neighbors, though she learned quickly not to speak of it too openly, lest she be labeled strange or worse. She would mention casually that a storm was coming in 2 days, and 2 days later the sky would darken and the wind would rise with the exact timing she had anticipated. She never made a show of this knowledge. It was simply something she knew, the way others knew how to bake bread or build a fence, a practical skill among many practical skills that frontier life demanded. When Marta was 19, she married a young man named Marta Ivashkina, whose family had arrived in the settlement 3 years earlier from a village further west. He was a woodworker, skilled at building and repair, and their marriage was built on mutual respect and the practical understanding that survival required partnership rather than romance, though affection grew between them steadily over time. They had 4 children over the next 7 years, 2 sons and 2 daughters, each arriving with the regularity that characterized frontier families where children were both blessing and necessity. Life settled into the rhythms of frontier existence, long, dark winters followed by brief, intense summers of frantic activity, the eternal cycle of preparation and endurance that defined this harsh place. Then, in the winter when Marta was 26 years old, Piotr died, and the carefully constructed life they'd built together collapsed with stunning swiftness. It happened quickly, an illness that began with chills and fever and ended 3 days later, despite everything Marta tried to do, despite the poultices and teas and desperate prayers that meant nothing to the fever that consumed him. She found herself alone with 4 children, the youngest barely walking, in the middle of a Siberian winter where temperatures dropped low enough to freeze the moisture in your breath before it could dissipate. The settlement helped, as settlements do when death visits, bringing food, offering to take the children temporarily, suggesting she might want to return to her mother's distant relatives in the West, where life was supposedly easier, though no one knew this for certain. But Marta had no interest in leaving, recognizing that starting over elsewhere with 4 small children and no resources would likely prove harder than staying in a place where at least she was known. This place, harsh as it was, had become her home in ways that transcended comfort or convenience. She knew its rhythms, its dangers, its subtle generosities, where berries grew in summer, which trees provided the best firewood, how the land changed with the seasons. She knew when storms were coming, and that knowledge, she understood, was worth more than distant family connections or the uncertain charity of strangers who might view her children as burdens rather than blessings. She kept her household together through that winter and the next, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She bartered her labor, sewing, preserving food, teaching children to read, for the resources she needed, establishing a complex web of mutual obligations that served in place of currency. Her own children grew quickly, shaped by necessity into competence that would have seemed remarkable in gentler circumstances. Her eldest son, at age 9, could already chop wood and tend fires with the efficiency of someone much older, understanding, without being told, that his family's survival depended on everyone contributing beyond their years. Her daughters learned to manage the small vegetable garden that provided precious fresh food during the brief summer months, and care for the goats Marta acquired through trade, animals whose milk and occasional meat made the difference between adequacy and hunger. They were poor, certainly by any standard measurement. Their clothes were patched, their meals simple, their cabin draughty, despite Marta's best efforts. But poverty on the frontier was relative in ways that city dwellers could never quite understand. Everyone struggled, and what mattered was not wealth but capability, and the willingness to adapt to circumstances that changed with the seasons and the weather. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest or the richest, but rather those who could adjust their expectations and methods to match what the land demanded. Marta's reputation as a storm reader grew over these years, spreading beyond her immediate neighbors to encompass the entire settlement and even reaching nearby communities through the gossip networks that connected frontier outposts. People began to pay attention when she mentioned incoming weather, noting the casual quality of her warnings that somehow made them more rather than less credible. They noticed that when Marta reinforced her roof or brought in extra firewood, a storm would indeed follow within a day or two, arriving with the timing she had implied without quite stating directly. Some dismissed this as coincidence or superstition, particularly the newer arrivals, who hadn't yet learned that frontier survival often depended on knowledge that couldn't be explained through conventional logic. But others, particularly those who'd lived through winters where lack of preparation had meant loss and suffering, began to quietly follow her example, understanding that Marta's instincts had proven more reliable than the sky's appearance or any other conventional weather sign. These people watched her movements in autumn and early winter with the attention usually reserved for reading important documents, knowing that her actions contained information vital to their survival. She never sought this role, never positioned herself as an authority or claimed special powers. She didn't announce predictions or offer advice unless asked, understanding that unsolicited counsel, however well-intentioned, often bred resentment rather than gratitude. But her actions spoke plainly enough to those who chose to observe them. When she was seen packing moss into the gaps in her cabin walls with particular urgency, her movements faster and more focused than usual, others would find themselves doing the same, some consciously and others through a kind of unconscious mimicry. When she moved her animals into their shelter earlier than usual, neighbors would glance at the sky, note its quality, perhaps seeing nothing remarkable themselves, and do likewise, trusting her judgment over their own observations. It was a form of leadership exercised through example rather than words, and it shaped the settlement's survival in ways that went unrecorded but were deeply felt. The year Marta turned 33 brought what would later be remembered as the season of two great storms, a winter that old-timers would reference for decades afterward when describing harsh conditions. The first arrived in early winter, earlier than usual, catching the settlement partially unprepared, despite the warnings some claimed to have sensed in the air. Marta had felt it coming for 3 days, a building pressure behind her eyes that made concentration difficult, an ache in her joints that had nothing to do with age or injury, and a quality to the silence that reminded her of her grandfather's teachings. The forest had gone quiet in that particular way he'd described, and her horses refused to settle despite adequate food and shelter. She prepared her household methodically, working with the deliberate efficiency that characterized all her actions, and she mentioned to several neighbors that something significant was approaching. Some listened, particularly those who'd learned to trust her instincts and began their own preparations with the urgency her tone implied. Others, distracted by the demands of daily survival or skeptical of predictions that seemed to come from nothing more than feeling and intuition, did not. They looked at the sky, saw nothing particularly threatening, and decided that their other tasks were more pressing than preparing for a storm that might never arrive. The storm hit with unusual violence, arriving in the night when most families were sleeping and transforming the world into chaos within hours. Wind drove snow horizontally across the settlement, piling drifts that buried fences and lower walls, erasing the familiar geography of the place until nothing looked quite right anymore. The temperature dropped so sharply that water left in containers cracked the vessels as it froze, the ice expanding with force enough to shatter ceramic and split wood. The storm lasted 2 full days and a night between them, and when it finally passed, the settlement emerged to survey the damage and count their losses. Several roofs had partially collapsed under snow weight, the beams groaning and then giving way with cracks that sounded like gunshots. One family lost most of their chickens when their coop's roof gave way, the birds freezing almost instantly in the terrible cold that rushed in. Another had their door blown partially open during the worst of the wind, filling half their cabin with snow before they could secure it again, spending the remainder of the storm huddled in the one warm corner that remained. Marta's household, and those of the neighbors who'd followed her example in preparing early and thoroughly, weathered the storm with minimal damage, emerging cold and tired, but fundamentally intact. But what made this season memorable was not the first storm, but what followed, an unprecedented event that would reshape how the settlement thought about winter preparation. 3 days after the initial storm ended, Marta felt the signs returning, and at first she thought she must be mistaken, that her body was still responding to the previous storm rather than presaging a new one. The same pressure in her sinuses, building slowly but unmistakably throughout the day. The same ache in her joints, spreading from her hands to her knees to her shoulders. The same quality of silence and light that preceded the first storm, as though the world was holding its breath before plunging once more into violence. But this seemed impossible. Storms didn't arrive in such quick succession, not storms of that magnitude, not in any pattern Marta had learned or heard described. There were usually weeks between major winter storms, time for recovery and re-preparation, time for settlements to repair damage and replenish depleted resources. Marta stood outside her cabin, studying the sky with growing concern that bordered on disbelief. The clouds were reforming, lower and heavier than before, moving with a purposeful quality that suggested gathering power. The temperature, which had risen slightly after the first storm, that brief, deceptive warming that sometimes follows severe cold, was dropping again, and she could feel the change in her skin, in the way the air moved against her face. She watched her horses. They were stamping nervously, refusing to settle even though she'd just fed them, and they should have been calm. Their eyes showed white at the edges, and they kept turning their heads toward the north, toward the direction from which the cold always came. She walked to the edge of the settlement and listened to the forest, standing motionless in the cold and paying attention with every sense she possessed. There, that distant groaning, those small cracks and pops that spoke of trees bracing themselves for another assault, the forest preparing for violence in ways that only those who knew how to listen could detect. Another storm was indeed coming, and it would arrive soon, perhaps within a day, perhaps sooner. The signs were unmistakable to someone with eyes trained to see them and ears trained to hear what most people filtered out as meaningless noise. She moved quickly, understanding that time was now more precious than caution or social nicety. First, she secured her own household, reinforcing the patches they'd made after the first storm, bringing in more firewood than seemed reasonable, stacking it until their small interior space was more crowded with wood than people. She moved all the animals inside, even though space was cramped and the smell would become unpleasant, knowing that living animals generated heat and that heat might make the difference between survival and catastrophe. Her children watched her work with wide eyes, understanding from her focused intensity that something unusual was happening. Then, without announcing her intentions or making a dramatic show of concern that might cause panic, she walked to the cabins of her neighbors, moving methodically from house to house. To the elderly couple who lived 3 houses away, she mentioned that she was preparing for more weather and wondered if they needed help securing their roof, phrasing it as an offer of assistance rather than a warning of impending danger. They looked at her with surprise. The sky was clear, relatively speaking, showing no obvious signs of the violence she was predicting, but they didn't refuse her help. Together with her eldest son, Marta helped them reinforce their roof beams and bring in extra supplies, working quickly but thoroughly. To the young family who'd lost their chickens in the first storm, she offered advice on temporarily housing the surviving birds in a sturdier location, suggesting they move them into the family's main cabin if necessary. To the family whose door had blown open, she helped rehang it more securely and showed them how to bar it with angled braces that would hold even under sustained pressure, using techniques her husband had taught her years ago. She didn't explain herself beyond saying she had a feeling more weather was coming, keeping her language vague and her tone casual. Some thought she was being overly cautious, perhaps traumatized by the first storm's intensity and seeing danger where none existed. Others, remembering her track record and the fact that she had never been wrong about these matters, took her seriously and began their own preparations. The settlement spent that day in a flurry of activity, not the panicked rushing of crisis, but the steady, purposeful work of people who'd been reminded that winter offers no second chances and that preparation attempted too late is merely futile effort. The second storm arrived the following morning, just as Marta had anticipated, though even she was surprised by its magnitude. It was larger than the first, colder and more sustained, as though winter had decided to demonstrate what it could truly accomplish when roused to full fury. The wind reached velocities that made the first storm seem almost gentle by comparison, velocities that bent trees and sent loose objects flying through the air like weapons. Snow didn't just fall or even blow, it seemed to attack, driven with such force that it found gaps no one knew existed, piling in corners and against walls in ways that defied normal drift patterns. The temperature dropped to depths that made breathing painful and turned exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes, cold so profound it seemed to penetrate through walls and clothing to attack the body directly. This storm lasted 3 days without pause, 3 days during which the wind never stopped its howling and the snow never stopped its assault. Inside her cramped cabin, Marta kept her family calm through force of will and careful planning. She'd arranged the interior space with careful thought, the warmest corner for sleeping, multiple layers of furs and blankets creating a nest of warmth, the animals positioned to maximize their heat contribution without crowding the living space unbearably. She'd anticipated they might be trapped inside for an extended period, so she'd rationed their supplies to stretch further than seemed necessary, calculating how many days they could endure if the storm lasted longer than expected. Her children, frightened by the howling wind and the way the cabin shook under its assault, the walls groaning and the roof creaking ominously, looked to her for reassurance. She gave it not through false optimism or cheerful lies, but through steady competence, maintaining the fire at exactly the right level, neither wasting wood nor allowing the temperature to drop, preparing simple meals on schedule, telling stories during the long, dark hours. She projected a calm certainty that they would endure, and her children, reading her demeanor the way she read the weather, believed her and took comfort. On the second day of the storm, when the wind was at its worst, and the cabin trembled under sustained gusts that seemed determined to tear it from its foundation, her eldest daughter asked if the roof would hold. The girl's voice was small, almost lost in the storm's roar, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Marta paused in her work. She was mending a tear in a blanket by the firelight, using careful stitches to extend its useful life, and considered the question seriously. She listened to the sounds the cabin was making, the creaks and groans of wood under stress, each sound telling her something about the structure's condition. She looked at the ceiling beams, noting how they flexed slightly, but didn't crack, how the joints held despite the pressure. "It will hold," she said finally, with a conviction that came from knowledge rather than hope, and her certainty made it true in a way that mere hope could not have done. Her confidence came from preparation, from knowledge, from having done everything possible to ensure survival. She had reinforced those beams herself, had checked every joint, had done the work that now made the difference between safety and disaster. The storm would do what storms do, indifferent to human suffering or desire, but she had done what humans could do, and the intersection of those two efforts would determine the outcome. On the third day, the wind began to ease, its fury gradually spending itself like a tantrum running its course. The howling diminished to a moan, then to a whisper, then to silence, that terrible, beautiful silence that meant the storm had passed and they had survived. That silence felt strange after 3 days of constant noise, almost louder in its way than the storm had been. Marta waited several hours after the wind stopped before attempting to open the door. Storms sometimes have a final surge, a last attempt to catch the unprepared, and she had learned patience through hard experience. But eventually she unbarred the door and pushed, using her shoulder to apply force. It didn't move, not even slightly, as though the door had become part of the wall. Snow had piled against it during the storm, and now it was blocked completely, the drift compressed by wind into a density approaching ice. She pushed harder, and her eldest son joined her, and together they forced it open a few inches, then a foot, then wide enough for Marta to slip through sideways. Outside, the world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful and terrible all at once. Snow had buried the settlement under drifts that reached above the cabin windows, erasing familiar landmarks and rendering the geography strange. The sky was clear now, a brilliant blue that hurt to look at after 3 days in dim firelight, and the sun reflecting off the snow was blinding. The cold was profound. The storm had dragged Arctic air down from the north, and now that air sat heavy and still over everything, cold so intense it seemed to stop time itself. Marta could feel her breath freezing in her nostrils as she inhaled, tiny crystals forming in the delicate membranes. She made her way to the nearest neighbor's cabin, wading through snow that came up to her waist, each step requiring effort that left her breathing hard. Their chimney was still smoking, a good sign, meaning the family had survived and maintained their fire. She called out and heard a muffled response from within, voices that held relief and exhaustion in equal measure. They were alive, trapped like her, but alive, and she felt a surge of gratitude that surprised her with its intensity. She moved from cabin to cabin, checking on each household, calling out and waiting for responses, noting which chimneys showed smoke and which didn't. Most had survived with varying degrees of hardship. Some were in good condition, others were suffering but alive, a few had lost animals or sustained damage, but remained intact as families. But 3 cabins showed no smoke, no signs of life, and Marta felt her heart sink, even as she maintained her outward calm. Marta organized the able-bodied to dig out those houses first, understanding that every minute might matter if people were trapped inside without heat. In 2 of them, they found families alive, but in desperate condition. Their firewood had run out on the 2nd day of the storm, and they'd huddled together in the dark and cold, burning furniture and anything else that would combust to create brief moments of warmth before the cold closed in again. They were suffering from exposure and frostbite, fingers and toes gone white and numb, but they would recover with time and care. The 3rd cabin was silent for a different reason, and Marta knew what they would find before they finished digging. The roof had collapsed under the weight of snow and sustained wind pressure, falling inward and crushing everything beneath, the beams giving way catastrophically. The family inside had died quickly, which was perhaps the only mercy that winter offered, death by crushing rather than the slow agony of freezing. The settlement mourned them in the way frontier communities mourn, with quiet grief and the practical necessity of moving forward, understanding that survival demanded they continue despite loss. The dead were prepared for burial once the ground thawed in spring, their bodies stored in a snow cave built for that purpose, treated with dignity even as their loss was absorbed into the settlement's collective memory. The living turned their attention to recovery and, crucially, to learning, understanding that this storm had taught lessons that needed to be understood and remembered. In the weeks that followed, as the settlement dug out and repaired damage and took stock of losses, Marta's methods became a topic of quiet conversation in the way that important matters are discussed without ever being formally addressed. People noticed that her cabin had sustained minimal damage, emerging from the storm essentially intact. They noticed that her family was in good condition, neither starving nor injured, her children healthy despite the ordeal. They noticed that those who'd followed her example in preparing after the first storm had also fared better than those who hadn't, and the correlation was too clear to ignore. There was no formal meeting, no official acknowledgement, but a subtle shift occurred in the settlement's collective approach to winter preparation. The following autumn, Marta's recommendations, though she never framed them as such, never presumed to tell others what to do, were quietly adopted across the settlement. When she reinforced her roof, others did the same, often without discussing why they were doing so. When she brought in extra moss for chinking gaps in walls, others noticed and gathered their own, following her schedule without being told. When she began preparing earlier than usual, others no longer questioned why, but simply began their own preparations, understanding that her timing came from knowledge they lacked. She had become, without seeking the role, a kind of informal guide, someone whose instincts and knowledge were trusted not because of any official authority, but because they consistently proved accurate and useful. This was leadership of a particular frontier variety, earned through competence, exercised through example, accepted because it served everyone's survival. Marta herself remained modest about this influence, uncomfortable with any suggestion that she possessed special wisdom. She saw it simply as sharing what she knew, the way her grandfather had shared his knowledge with her, a practical exchange rather than an assertion of superiority. There was no pride in it, no sense of being somehow better than her neighbors, only a practical understanding that survival on the frontier was a collective effort, and that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. If she knew when storms were coming, and sharing that knowledge helped others prepare, then sharing was simply the obvious thing to do. She continued to raise her children, to maintain her household, to barter her skills for what she needed, living a life that looked ordinary from the outside. As the years passed and her children grew into capable adults who eventually established their own households, Marta became a fixture of the settlement, one of those people whose presence is so fundamental that it's easy to forget they haven't always been there. Young families would seek her advice not just about storms, but about 100 other aspects of frontier life: how to preserve food for winter, when to plant crops, how to treat common illnesses, where to find good firewood. She became a repository of practical wisdom, a bridge between the indigenous knowledge she'd learned as a child and the settler adaptations that experience had taught her, someone who could explain both why things worked and how to make them work better. In her later years, when her hair had gone grey and her joints ached, not just before storms but constantly, a reminder of age and all the years she'd worked in harsh conditions, Marta would sometimes think back to her grandfather. She understood now why he'd taken the time to teach a small child things that seemed abstract and strange, knowledge that could not be immediately applied but needed to be absorbed slowly over years. Knowledge, he'd known, must be passed forward or it dies, and each generation that fails to teach the next severs the chain of understanding that keeps people alive. And frontier life, harsh and unforgiving as it was, could not afford to lose the accumulated understanding of how to read the land, the sky, the animals, and all the subtle signs that meant the difference between preparation and disaster. She taught her own grandchildren in turn, taking the same patient approach her grandfather had used with her. She taught them to watch the sky, to listen to the forest, to pay attention to how animals behaved when change was coming, trying to instill in them the same quality of focused attention she had developed. She taught them that storm preparation began long before storms arrived, in summer when you gathered materials, in autumn when you reinforced and repaired, in the first cold weeks of winter when you established routines and checked supplies. She taught them that survival was not dramatic or heroic, but consisted of small, careful actions repeated with consistency and attention, the unglamorous work that kept people alive when drama would have killed them. Marta died in the spring of 1854 at the age of 65, which was considered quite old for the frontier, where most people died younger from accidents, illness, or the simple accumulated toll of harsh conditions. She passed quietly in her sleep, having spent the previous day working in her garden, preparing the soil for planting, doing the work that marked the transition from winter to the growing season. The settlement buried her in the small cemetery at the edge of the forest, and though there was no official ceremony or grand memorial, frontier pragmatism extended even to death, her absence was felt profoundly. For years afterward, people would mention her name when discussing storm preparation, when teaching children about weather signs, when making decisions about when to begin winter preparations. Marta would have started reinforcing by now, someone would say, and that would settle the question without need for further discussion. Her legacy was not in any grand achievement or dramatic rescue, but in the quiet accumulation of lives saved, hardships prevented, and knowledge preserved, contributions that couldn't be counted but whose absence would have been catastrophic. She represented something essential about frontier survival, that it required not just individual strength, but the willingness to share expertise, to help neighbors, to think beyond one's own immediate needs. She showed that leadership could be exercised through example rather than authority, and that sometimes the most important contributions are the ones that prevent disasters from occurring in the first place, the invisible work of preparation that makes survival possible. In the settlement's collective memory, Marta became something more than a historical person with dates and facts attached to her name. She became a symbol of preparedness, attention, and the subtle wisdom of those who learned to read the world's warnings, a figure who represented values the community wanted to preserve. Stories about her, some true, some embellished, some perhaps invented entirely, but containing truth of a deeper kind, continued to circulate for generations. Children were told about the woman who could feel storms in her bones, who saved her neighbors through careful preparation, who understood that winter's violence could be survived if one paid attention and acted on what that attention revealed. And in this way, Marta's life, quiet and unrecorded by official histories, nonetheless shaped the future of this frontier settlement, and perhaps others beyond it. Her knowledge became embedded in the settlement's practices, becoming simply how things are done without anyone quite remembering where these practices originated. Her methods became tradition, passed down not as Marta's way, but as the obvious natural way to prepare for winter. And her understanding that preparation was an act of care for both self and community became part of how people thought about winter survival, an unspoken ethic that shaped behavior across generations. She asked for no recognition, sought no fame, and would likely have been uncomfortable with the idea that her name might be remembered beyond her own lifetime. But the frontier, in its way, offers its own form of immortality, not through monuments or written records, but through the continuation of useful knowledge, through the lives saved by practices passed down, through the quiet inheritance of wisdom that allows people to endure. As winter follows autumn and storms follow silence, so too does knowledge pass from one generation to the next, carried not in grand proclamations, but in small gestures, careful preparations, and the willingness to teach those who are ready to learn. Marta understood this instinctively, not through philosophy, but through lived experience. And in understanding it, she became part of something larger than her individual life. She became part of the continuous human effort to survive, adapt, and pass forward the lessons that winter teaches to all who live under its harsh instruction. Her life proved that significance isn't measured in official recognition or dramatic moments, but in the steady accumulation of small acts that make survival possible for others. The storms came every winter, as they always had and always would, indifferent to human presence or suffering. But because Marta had lived, because she had learned and taught and shared, those storms claimed fewer victims than they might have, and that difference, invisible in any record book, was everything. Let us drift now from Marta's story into something stranger, more elusive, into the realm of archaeological puzzles and cultural practices that still resist complete understanding. When researchers began systematically studying the remains of frontier settlements in Siberia during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found structures and artifacts that raised questions without offering clear answers. These discoveries emerged slowly, often by accident, accumulating over decades like snowfall that gradually reveals the shape of what lies beneath. A farmer ploughing a field would uncover foundation stones arranged in patterns that seemed purposeful but inexplicable, their geometry suggesting intention without revealing meaning. A hunter, sheltering in abandoned ruins, would notice markings on walls that didn't match any known writing system or decorative tradition, symbols that seemed to hover between language and ornament. Archaeologists cataloguing settlement remains would find construction features that seemed to serve no obvious function, or whose function, if guessed at, suggested beliefs and practices that had gone unrecorded in written histories. One of the earliest puzzles involved roofs, those most fundamental of protective structures. In a cluster of settlements in the eastern taiga, researchers found remnants of cabins built with double roof structures, not simply a roof with an attic space beneath, but two distinct layers separated by a gap of perhaps 2 feet, creating a void whose purpose was not immediately apparent. The lower roof was standard construction, solid planking that would have kept out wind and precipitation. But the upper roof, instead of being solid planking, consisted of logs laid in a peculiar lattice pattern, with deliberate gaps between them, openings that seemed to invite the very elements a roof should exclude. Initially, archaeologists assumed this was simply deterioration, that there had once been material filling those gaps that had since rotted away, victim to decades or centuries of exposure. But chemical analysis of the wood showed no evidence of attachment points for additional materials, no nail holes or mortise joints that would have secured now vanished components. The gaps appeared to be intentional, designed into the structure from the beginning. Why would anyone build a roof with gaps in it, deliberately compromising the shelter that stood between inhabitants and the killing cold of Siberian winter? The obvious concern would be that snow would filter through, accumulating between the two roof layers and adding weight without providing insulation, creating a burden that served no purpose. But excavations revealed that the space between roof layers contained evidence of controlled burning. Scorch marks, ash residue, and the remains of what appeared to be carefully arranged combustible materials, suggesting fires had been deliberately set in this unlikely location. It seemed that inhabitants had occasionally lit small, controlled fires in the space between their roof layers, transforming dead air space into something actively heated. The purpose of this practice remains uncertain, and competing theories have been proposed by researchers attempting to reconcile physical evidence with imaginable human intention. One theory suggests it was a way to prevent dangerous snow accumulation. By occasionally warming the upper roof layer from beneath, inhabitants could cause accumulated snow to partially melt and slide off before reaching crushing weight. Another theory proposes that the smoke from these fires served some purpose, perhaps as an insect deterrent during brief warm periods, or as part of a ritual practice whose logic has been lost to time. The indigenous Evenki people, when asked about this in later years, acknowledged that similar techniques existed in their traditions, but explained them in ways that combined practical and spiritual reasoning, refusing to separate function from meaning. The fires, they said, kept both the snow and certain harmful spirits from settling too heavily on a dwelling, serving simultaneously as engineering and protection of a different order. Another mystery involved what archaeologists initially termed storm corridors, passages that suggested both practical necessity and something more complex. In several settlements, excavation revealed underground passages connecting houses, not full tunnels that one could walk through upright, but narrow, low passages through which a person might crawl, moving through darkness beneath the frozen earth. These passages were carefully constructed with wooden reinforcement and appeared to have been maintained over extended periods, their timbers replaced when rot threatened structural integrity. They ran between dwellings at depths of 3 to 4 feet below the surface, well below the frost line, safe from the seasonal heaving that destroys shallower constructions. The practical explanation seemed obvious at first. These allowed movement between houses during severe storms when snow accumulation made surface travel impossible, providing lifelines between isolated families. But certain features of the corridors troubled this interpretation, introducing complications that suggested purposes beyond simple transit. Some passages connected houses in ways that suggested social rather than practical considerations, bypassing nearer dwellings to connect with more distant ones, suggesting specific relationships between certain families that determined the architecture of connection. Others included small alcoves or widened chambers at intervals, their purpose unclear, too small to serve as living spaces, but carefully constructed with fitted stones and traces of what might have been seating or storage platforms. Most puzzling were the markings found in some corridors, symbols carved into the wooden support beams that didn't match any known written language, a script or system that served purposes we can only speculate about. Some researchers suggested these might be simple ownership marks or construction notes, the practical jottings of builders recording their work, but their placement seemed too deliberate for that. They appeared at regular intervals, always at the same height on the left side of the passage when traveling in a specific direction, suggesting a system rather than random notation. One archaeologist spent years documenting these symbols, traveling between excavation sites and photographing every mark she could find, eventually identifying approximately 40 distinct marks that appeared in various combinations. She proposed they might represent a form of wayfinding system, a way to navigate between houses during storms when visibility was zero, and disorientation a real danger, when the crawl through darkness needed guidance beyond memory. But if so, why were some symbols elaborately decorative while others were simple geometric shapes? And why did the system seem to encode more information than simple navigation would require? And why did certain combinations appear repeatedly across different settlements, separated by hundreds of miles, suggesting either communication between distant communities or independent development of similar solutions to shared problems? The mystery deepened when ethnographic research revealed that Evenki and Yakut peoples had their own traditions of marked passages and symbolic wayfinding systems, but their symbols, while sometimes similar in general character, didn't match the specific marks found in the frontier settlements. This suggested either independent development of similar concepts or, more intriguingly, a blending of indigenous knowledge with settler innovation, creating hybrid practices that belonged fully to neither culture. The boundary between cultural borrowing and parallel invention became blurred, as often happens in frontier spaces where necessity drives experimentation. Items found within homes added further layers of mystery, objects whose purposes hover between the obvious and the obscure. In multiple settlements, archaeologists discovered small bone whistles, carefully carved and often decorated with incised patterns that suggested they were valued beyond their mere utility. These whistles produced sounds at the very edge of human hearing, high, thin notes that carried strangely in cold air, frequencies that seemed designed for specific acoustic properties. Initially classified as children's toys or hunting tools, categories that seemed to explain their existence adequately, their context suggested something more complex. They were typically found near doorways or windows, often deliberately placed in small niches or hung from pegs in ways that suggested they were meant to remain in specific locations rather than be carried about. Some were found with traces of fabric or leather that might have been wrappings or covers, suggesting they were protected when not in use. When researchers played these whistles under winter conditions, conducting experiments in falling snow and wind, they discovered that the sound carried remarkably well through precipitation and atmospheric disturbance, better, in some cases, than human voices. This suggested they might have been used for signaling between houses during storms, a way to check on neighbors or call for help when visual communication was impossible and shouting might not carry through the wind's roar. But interviews with descendants of frontier settlers revealed another explanation, or perhaps a complementary one, that didn't negate the practical function. The whistles, some elderly informants claimed, were protective devices, objects whose power lay in their sound rather than their mere presence. Certain frequencies, when played at specific times, were believed to ward off what they called storm spirits, entities associated with winter's worst violence, presences that moved within the blizzard itself. Whether these spirits were understood literally or metaphorically is unclear, and perhaps the distinction mattered less to those who lived with winter's threats than it does to us attempting to understand from a safe distance. Some descriptions suggest they represented the psychological dangers of winter, madness, despair, the creeping fear that comes from extended isolation and darkness, from too many days without sunlight or human contact beyond one's immediate family. Others described them in more concrete terms, presences that moved within storms, that could confuse travelers and lead them away from safety, that might enter homes if not properly barred. The whistles, according to this understanding, created a kind of auditory boundary, a claimed space within which human presence was asserted against the encompassing emptiness of winter storms. The sound marked territory in a realm where visual markers disappeared beneath snow, where the familiar became strange, and the boundary between shelter and wilderness collapsed into white chaos. Wooden carvings found in many frontier homes present another puzzle, objects that exist at the intersection of art, tool, and talisman. These are typically small, hand-sized or smaller, and depict swirling spiral patterns that seem to represent wind or snow in motion, capturing in static wood the dynamic chaos of blizzard. They're carved with considerable skill, often from single pieces of dense wood like birch or larch, and show evidence of repeated handling. The wood worn smooth by countless touches over years or decades. Their purpose is uncertain, and researchers have proposed multiple interpretations without reaching consensus. Some researchers categorize them as folk art, decorative objects created during long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible and hands needed occupation. But their consistent placement near doorways and windows, and the fact that they're often found embedded in walls or fitted into specially carved niches, suggests they served some function beyond decoration. One theory proposes they were teaching tools, physical representations of storm patterns used to educate children about how wind and snow move, how to read the shapes of drifts, how to predict where accumulation would be heaviest. By studying these carved representations, children could learn to visualize storm dynamics before experiencing them directly, building mental models that might save their lives in whiteout conditions. Another interpretation, drawn from indigenous traditions and the testimony of those who maintained connections to older ways of knowing, suggests they served as focal points for meditation or visualization. By contemplating the carved spirals during the long darkness of winter, inhabitants could maintain psychological balance, reminding themselves that storms, however chaotic they seemed, followed patterns and would eventually end. Perhaps most intriguing are the markings found on doorways and window frames in numerous settlements, symbols that appear with such frequency that they clearly represent some common practice. These consist of symbols etched or carved into wood, lines, circles, crosses, and more complex geometric patterns that sometimes combine multiple elements into composite signs whose meaning eludes modern interpretation. They appear with such regularity that they clearly represent some common practice, yet their meaning remains elusive, resistant to the kind of systematic analysis that has decoded other historical symbol systems. The patterns vary between settlements and even between individual homes, suggesting personal or family-specific systems rather than a unified cultural practice that could be learned and applied universally. Some show clear weathering patterns indicating they were carved shortly after construction and then left exposed to the elements for years, accumulating the patina of time. Others appear fresher, suggesting they were periodically renewed or added to over time, maintained as an ongoing practice rather than a single act of inscription. Chemical analysis has revealed that some were originally filled with pigments, red ochre, charcoal black, even traces of blue derived from certain minerals, though these colors have long since faded, leaving only the carved channels as evidence. The use of color suggests these markings were meant to be visible, to catch the eye, and perhaps the attention of forces beyond the human. The indigenous peoples of the region have their own traditions of protective markings, symbols carved or painted, to ward off harm or invoke beneficial influences. Some of the frontier symbols show clear similarities to Evenki and Yakut designs, suggesting direct transmission of knowledge or at least observation and adoption of practices that seemed effective. But many don't match any known indigenous patterns, suggesting either innovation by settlers or the preservation of European folk practices that had been carried east, traveling across continents in the memories of migrants. When pressed to explain these markings, elderly descendants of frontier families offer varied interpretations that sometimes contradict each other, suggesting that even within the culture that created them, meanings may have varied or evolved. Some say they're blessings or prayers, physical manifestations of hope that the structure will endure, that those who shelter within will be protected from harm. Others describe them as measurements or records, marking the height of past snowdrifts or the dates of significant storms, creating a historical archive carved into the very structure of home. Still others admit uncertainty, saying only that their grandparents carved them because their own grandparents had done so, and that it felt wrong not to maintain the practice even if its original meaning had been forgotten. This transmission of form without content, of practice without full understanding, is common in folk traditions and suggests that the act itself carried meaning beyond any specific interpretation. Excavations have also revealed curious features in the construction of some frontier homes, deep pits dug beneath floors, lined with stones and accessible through trapdoors, spaces that drop beneath the foundation into darkness. Initially, archaeologists assumed these were root cellars for food storage, a common feature in many cultures attempting to preserve harvests through winter months. But several factors complicate this interpretation, introducing questions that challenge the obvious explanation. First, many of these pits show little evidence of having been used for food storage. No remains of vegetable matter, no traces of the oils or minerals that would leach from stored foods over time, staining stone and wood. Second, some are too small to serve as effective storage spaces, barely large enough for a person to crouch in, offering insufficient volume for meaningful quantities of provisions. Third, they're often located in strange places, not near the hearth or in corners where they'd be easy to access, but in the center of the room or near doorways, positions that would make them inconvenient for regular use as storage. One researcher has proposed that these might have been emergency shelters, spaces where inhabitants could take refuge if the main structure caught fire or if the roof collapsed during a storm, providing a protected void below the level of danger. The pit would be below the level of smoke and falling debris, and its stone lining would provide some protection from heat and impact, potentially saving lives in catastrophic situations. But this doesn't explain why many show evidence of regular use: worn edges on the stone lining, soot marks suggesting small fires had been lit within them, and in some cases deliberately smoothed surfaces suggesting people spent time sitting or lying there. The pattern of use suggests not emergency but routine, something practiced regularly rather than reserved for crisis. Another interpretation draws on indigenous practices of creating below-ground spaces for spiritual purposes, places of retreat, meditation, or connection with earth spirits, spaces where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality might become permeable. The Evenki tradition includes practices of seeking visions or guidance by spending time in confined, dark spaces during winter, allowing sensory deprivation and cold to alter consciousness. Supporting this theory is the fact that some pits contain small carved niches in their walls, suitable for holding candles or small objects, and a few show traces of what might have been deliberate decorations. Scratched patterns or arrangements of stones that seem purposeful rather than random suggest these spaces were prepared with care, that time was spent making them into something more than mere holes in the ground. Cultural beliefs about storms themselves present another area of fascinating ambiguity, where practical knowledge shades into something that might be called mythological understanding. Written records from frontier settlements are sparse and focus mainly on practical matters: harvests, trade, births, and deaths, the accounting of survival rather than the recording of belief. But fragments of letters, occasional diary entries, and later oral histories reveal a complex relationship between settlers and winter storms that combined practical respect with something approaching mythological understanding, treating weather as something with agency and intention. Storms were not simply weather events but presences, entities with something like personality or intent, actors in the drama of winter survival rather than mere circumstances to be endured. Different storms had different characters, and experienced settlers claimed to recognize these differences. This storm would be brief but violent, that one would be long but less intense, another would bring not just snow but a particular quality of cold that seemed to penetrate differently. These weren't merely practical distinctions based on meteorological observation, but carried emotional or spiritual weight, as if storms possessed qualities beyond the measurable. Some storms were described in neutral terms, as natural events to be endured with the same patience one might apply to any challenge. Others were spoken of with language that suggested agency, storms that sought out the unprepared, that tested the community, that came with purpose, as if winter itself was conscious and making choices about whom to spare and whom to claim. Whether this language was metaphorical or reflected genuine belief in some form of storm consciousness is difficult to determine from fragmentary records, and perhaps the distinction didn't matter much to those using such language. The indigenous peoples of the region had their own storm traditions, often personifying winter weather as entities that could be appeased, negotiated with, or at least acknowledged through proper ritual, treating relationship with weather as relationship with beings rather than mere response to conditions. Frontier settlers, exposed to these beliefs over time and living under conditions that made winter's power undeniable, may have absorbed or adapted such concepts, finding in indigenous framework a language for experiences they needed to articulate. Or they may have brought their own folk beliefs from European traditions. Russia, after all, has rich folklore about winter spirits, from the relatively benign Father Frost to darker entities associated with deadly cold and blizzards, figures that populate story and caution. Ritual practices around storms add another layer of mystery, behaviors that seemed to serve both practical and symbolic functions simultaneously. Several sources mention the burning of specific substances before or during storms, resinous wood like pine or fir, certain herbs gathered in summer and dried, sometimes animal fat mixed with aromatic plants, creating smoke with particular qualities. The stated purpose varied depending on who was asked and when, suggesting multiple functions or evolving interpretations. Some said these burning substances helped purify the air in sealed cabins, preventing the buildup of harmful vapors that could accumulate when homes were closed tight against the cold for days at a time. Others claimed they served to ward off illness or misfortune, their smoke carrying protective properties that worked through mechanisms beyond the physical. Still others spoke of them as offerings or acknowledgements, a way of marking the storm's arrival, of showing respect to forces beyond human control, of participating in something larger than mere shelter. The smoke from these fires was sometimes directed out through small gaps in roofs or walls, creating thin columns that rose into the storm, messages sent into chaos. One account, written by a missionary visiting a frontier settlement in the 1830s, describes witnessing a ritual performed at the first sign of an approaching storm, a communal act that preceded practical preparation. The community gathered briefly near a large stone that marked the settlement's center, a landmark that remained visible even when snow obscured everything else. One of the elders placed a handful of grain on the stone, spoke words the missionary couldn't hear over the rising wind, and then each family member added something, a bit of bread, a few drops of water or milk, small items whose significance the missionary couldn't determine. Then they returned to their homes and began their practical preparations, securing shutters and checking provisions, but only after this ritual acknowledgement had been completed. When the missionary later asked about this practice, he received vague answers. It was tradition, it was respectful, it was what had always been done, explanations that explained nothing while suggesting the practice was too fundamental to require justification. No one could or would explain the specific significance of each element or the words that had been spoken, either because the knowledge was protected or because it had become detached from explicit meaning. Such practices seem to exist at the boundary between practical psychology and something more mystical, rituals that helped communities transition from normal time into storm time, that marked the seriousness of what was coming, that provided a sense of having done everything possible, including things beyond the purely physical. Sound plays a curious role in several recorded practices, suggesting that the auditory dimension of winter survival was as important as the physical. Beyond the bone whistles already mentioned, some sources describe the ringing of small bells at specific times during storms, not large church bells, but small handbells or collections of metal objects struck together to create ringing tones that penetrated the wind's roar. The stated purpose was sometimes practical, to signal between homes, to mark the passage of time when days and nights blurred together in darkness, when the usual markers of temporal progression disappeared. But other descriptions suggest deeper significance, functions that went beyond mere coordination or timekeeping. The sound, some said, helped maintain human presence within the storm's overwhelming noise, asserting consciousness against the chaos that threatened to dissolve all structure. It was a way of asserting that people were still there, still conscious, still holding their ground against the wind's howling, still participants in time rather than lost in winter's suspension of normal existence. One account describes a practice of ringing bells at intervals throughout a storm's duration, creating a kind of auditory anchor that helped prevent the psychological dissolution that could occur during days of darkness and isolation. The sound-marked moments created rhythm, reminded those who heard it that others were also enduring, that they were not alone in their struggle even when separated by walls and weather. Certain settlements developed specific storm traditions that seem unique to their locations, suggesting that frontier culture was not uniform but varied according to local conditions and community composition. In one area, excavations revealed patterns of painted stones arranged in circles around settlement perimeters, not large enough to serve any defensive purpose against human or animal threats, but deliberately placed and clearly maintained over time. When these stones were analyzed, they showed traces of pigments that would have made them visible even under snow, red ochre and charcoal creating dark marks against white, beacons that remained legible when everything else vanished. The pattern suggested a boundary marker, a claimed space within which the settlement existed, a declaration of human territory in the midst of wilderness. But whether this was primarily practical, helping disoriented people find their way back during storms, or served some protective function is unclear, and perhaps the two purposes cannot be separated. Descendants of that area's settlers described them as anchor stones, suggesting they helped ground or stabilize the community, though whether this was meant literally or metaphorically was not explained and may not need to be. The relationship between frontier settlers and indigenous storm knowledge remains one of the more complex aspects of this cultural archaeology, a process of transmission and transformation that resists simple narratives. Clearly, significant knowledge transfer occurred. Settlers adopted snowshoe designs, learned to read weather signs, incorporated architectural features from indigenous traditions, taking what worked and adapting it to their own needs and circumstances. But the process wasn't simple transmission from one group to another, not a straightforward adoption of superior techniques by those less skilled. Settlers adapted what they learned, combining it with their own European folk knowledge, innovating based on their specific circumstances, creating solutions that drew on multiple sources without being reducible to any single one. The result was a hybrid culture of winter survival that belonged fully to neither tradition but drew from both, a frontier synthesis that was something new in the world. This creates challenges for modern researchers trying to trace the origins of specific practices, attempting to determine what came from where and how it changed in transmission. When we find a protective symbol carved into a doorway, is it derived from Evenki tradition, Russian folk belief, or something created on the frontier itself in response to specific needs and conditions? Often the answer is probably all three, a fusion of influences that produce something new, something that couldn't have existed without all its contributing elements. And this fusion wasn't merely practical, not just a matter of combining the best techniques for physical survival. The spiritual or psychological dimensions of storm survival, the ways people maintained hope, meaning, and identity during winter's darkest periods, also show evidence of cultural blending, of different frameworks for understanding, combining, and creating new possibilities. Indigenous concepts of relationship with land and weather mixed with European Christian beliefs and folk superstitions, creating frontier spiritualities that formal religious authorities often viewed with suspicion, but that served crucial functions for those living on winter's edge. These hybrid beliefs helped people make sense of their situation, provided frameworks for understanding experiences that exceeded normal human limits, offered ways to maintain agency and hope when circumstances seemed overwhelming. Perhaps the deepest mystery isn't any specific artifact or practice, but the question of how psychological survival was maintained, how human consciousness endured conditions that threatened to extinguish it. Winter on the Siberian frontier meant months of severe cold, weeks of near-total darkness, storms that could trap families in their homes for days at a time, isolation that separated people from all social contact beyond those immediately present. The physical challenges were immense, maintaining adequate heat, preventing frostbite, ensuring sufficient food supplies, but so were the mental ones: isolation from broader community, monotony of daily routine, the constant awareness of danger lurking just beyond the walls, the loss of temporal markers that normally structure human experience. All these threatened psychological dissolution. How did people maintain sanity, hope, and social cohesion under such conditions, preserving their humanity when circumstances seemed designed to strip it away? The artifacts and structures we find in archaeological sites must have played roles in this psychological survival, but their exact functions are often unclear because such things are rarely recorded in written documents, relegated to the realm of practice rather than explicit knowledge. The carved spirals, the protective symbols, the underground chambers, the ritual practices. These weren't simply practical tools, but ways of creating meaning, structure, and connection in an environment that constantly threatened to dissolve all three. They transformed mere endurance into something purposeful, gave shape to experience that might otherwise have become shapeless, maintained the frameworks of meaning that make human life distinct from mere biological persistence. Some researchers have suggested that the very act of creating these things, carving protective symbols during long winter evenings, maintaining ritual practices, teaching children about storm signs through carved representations, served functions beyond their stated purposes, operating at multiple levels simultaneously. They provided something to do during enforced idleness when outdoor work was impossible, and hands needed occupation, preventing the restlessness that can arise from too much stillness. They created intergenerational connections through shared knowledge, maintaining bonds between old and young when age groups might otherwise have drifted into separate worlds of experience. They gave people a sense of agency and control in situations where control was largely illusory, allowing the feeling of doing something rather than passively accepting whatever winter brought. The mystery then isn't just, what did these objects mean, but how did the practice of creating and using them help people endure? A question that recognizes function operates at multiple levels, that tools serve psychological and social purposes alongside their practical applications. In recent decades, climate researchers studying historical weather patterns have added new dimensions to these mysteries, providing context that makes some practices more comprehensible. Analysis of tree rings, ice cores, and other climate proxies suggests that the period of frontier settlement in Siberia coincided with particularly severe and variable winter conditions, part of what's sometimes called the Little Ice Age, though conditions varied significantly by region and decade. This means the people we're studying weren't just dealing with normal Siberian winters, themselves extreme by most standards, but with conditions that were exceptional even by local standards, pushing against the outer limits of human endurance. This context makes some of the archaeological findings more comprehensible, explaining what might otherwise seem like excessive preparation or overreaction. The double routes, the underground passages, the elaborate preparation practices, these weren't overreactions but appropriate responses to genuinely dangerous conditions, adaptations to circumstances that required every advantage that ingenuity could provide. And it suggests that the psychological and spiritual practices around storms might have been especially important during this period, not luxuries, but necessities. When facing conditions at the edge of human survival, purely practical approaches might not have been sufficient to maintain the will to persist. People needed ways to make sense of their situation, to find meaning in their struggle, to maintain hope when objective circumstances offered little reason for optimism and every reason for despair. The artifacts we find, then, aren't just tools for physical survival, but tools for maintaining humanity itself in circumstances that threatened to strip it away, that reduced existence to the barest struggle for warmth and sustenance. As we drift through these archaeological fragments and historical mysteries, a picture emerges, incomplete, hazy, but compelling in its suggestion of vanished worlds and forgotten knowledge. Frontier settlements weren't just collections of practical structures, but complex cultural spaces where knowledge, belief, and practice intertwined, where multiple traditions met and merged, where innovation happened at the intersection of necessity and imagination. The people who lived there were engaged in a constant process of adaptation, drawing on multiple cultural traditions without being limited to any one of them, innovating based on experience and observation, creating new forms of knowledge that were both deeply practical and richly meaningful. Some of what they created survives in physical form, waiting in ruins and excavation sites to be interpreted by archaeologists and historians attempting to reconstruct vanished ways of life. Much has been lost, practices that existed only in demonstration and memory. Knowledge that was never written down because it seemed too fundamental to require recording, beliefs that died with the last generation that possessed them. And some remains mysterious despite our best efforts at interpretation, artifacts that refuse to yield their full significance to analysis, practices whose purposes we can guess at but never fully know. This uncertainty is perhaps appropriate, fitting for a subject that resists complete understanding. Winter storms themselves resist complete understanding. We can measure wind speeds and snowfall amounts, create models that predict their movement and intensity, but the experience of being surrounded by days of howling wind and darkness contains elements that numbers cannot capture. Similarly, the human responses to winter's extremes, the things people did to survive not just physically but psychologically, socially, spiritually, resist reduction to simple explanations or single-cause analyses. We're left with fragments, suggestions, possibilities, interpretations that seem plausible but cannot be confirmed, understandings that feel right without being provable. And perhaps, as we settle deeper into this quiet contemplation of the past, that's enough for our purposes. The mysteries don't need complete resolution to teach us something important about human resilience, creativity, and the endless capacity to adapt, endure, and find meaning even in circumstances that seem designed to crush meaning entirely. The frontier settlers, with their carved symbols and protective rituals, their underground chambers and bone whistles, were engaged in the fundamental human work of survival, not just biological survival, but the survival of hope, community, and the belief that endurance mattered. That their exact methods sometimes elude our understanding doesn't diminish their achievement or render it less worthy of contemplation. It reminds us that some aspects of human experience resist complete documentation or analysis, existing in the realm of lived knowledge that can be demonstrated but not fully explained, that operates through practice rather than theory. And so the mysteries remain, preserved in artifacts and fragments, waiting in the cold earth, like seeds that might still yield understanding to those patient enough to sit with uncertainty and attentive enough to listen to what the silence suggests, to what the gaps in knowledge themselves reveal about the nature of human adaptation to extreme conditions. Let us turn now from the mysteries of common folk and archaeological fragments to another dimension of frontier winter, the world of those who possessed wealth, status, and the resources that such advantages provided. The contrast illuminates not just differences in comfort, but reveals how winter, despite all human attempts to control it, remained a force that humbled even the privileged. The elite on the Siberian frontier were a varied group. Some were government officials sent from European Russia to administer distant territories, their positions secured through family connections or imperial appointment. Others were successful merchants who'd built fortunes on the fur trade, controlling networks of trappers and transportation routes. Still others were military officers commanding remote garrisons, or members of the minor nobility who'd accepted positions in Siberia for the higher salaries and opportunities that frontier service provided. What united them was access to resources that common settlers could only imagine. Their homes were built not by their own hands through seasons of labor, but by hired workers, often constructed over single summers using materials brought from great distances. The foundations were stone rather than earth, requiring skilled masons and transported rock. The walls were thick timber, properly seasoned and fitted, with real glass in the windows, precious, fragile glass that had traveled thousands of miles in padded crates, each pane a small fortune that transformed the experience of winter by allowing light without admitting cold. Inside these homes, space itself became a luxury. Where a settler family might live in a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, Elite households sprawled across multiple chambers. There were separate rooms for sleeping, eating, receiving guests, and conducting business. There were spaces designated for servants, who formed an essential but often invisible layer of the household's functioning. And there was redundancy, multiple hearths, multiple storage areas, enough space that if one section grew too cold or developed problems, the household could simply relocate to another part of the structure. Winter preparation for the elite began earlier and proceeded differently. In late summer, when settlers were still focused on final harvests and basic repairs, elite households were already stockpiling on a scale that spoke of different priorities and possibilities. Caravans arrived from distant cities carrying goods ordered months in advance, not just necessities, but comforts. Tea from China preserved in sealed containers. Sugar refined and white, wrapped in cloth and paper. Spices that had traveled from India and Persia. Tobacco, both for personal use and for trade. Wax candles which burned cleaner and brighter than the tallow that settlers made from animal fat. Books, precious things, carefully packed to survive the journey. Volumes of poetry, philosophy, technical manuals, novels from European presses. These arrivals were events watched by the entire community. The elite pretended not to notice the attention, but the watching mattered. It reminded everyone of the distinctions that structured frontier life, the invisible lines between those who could order tea from China and those who made do with birch bark infusions, between those who read by beeswax candlelight and those who rationed every precious inch of tallow. The physical preparation of elite homes involved delegation. Where a settler personally stuffed every crack with moss and sealed every gap with clay, elite households employed workers for such tasks. Teams of laborers spent weeks in autumn weatherproofing the large structures, replacing damaged roof sections, applying fresh chinking, installing the glass windows if they'd been removed for summer, checking the integrity of stone foundations, clearing gutters and drainage channels. The elite supervised this work, sometimes offering suggestions based on their own observations, but their hands remained clean and their backs unstrung by heavy labor. The firewood requirements for an elite household were substantial. Multiple hearths meant multiple supplies, and the expectation was not just warmth, but comfort. Rooms maintained at temperatures that allowed one to sit in relative ease, to write letters without fingers stiffening, to sleep without piling on every available fur and blanket. Acquiring this much firewood required either extensive land holdings where trees could be harvested, or the wealth to purchase from those who made their living supplying fuel. Either way, it represented resources beyond what most settlers possessed. The wood itself was often superior, properly seasoned hardwoods that burned longer and hotter than the hastily gathered mixture that settlers used. It was split to uniform sizes, stacked in dedicated storage structures that kept it dry and organized, and brought into the house by servants as needed. The elite could afford to be selective. This wood for the main hearth in the receiving room where guests might be entertained. That wood for bedroom fires that would burn through the night. Food preparation for winter showed similar disparities. While settlers dried fish and preserved vegetables in whatever ways they could manage with limited materials, elite households had access to better preservation methods. Salt, that valuable commodity, could be used more liberally. Vinegar for pickling arrived in large quantities. Sugar allowed for preserving fruits in ways that extended both shelf life and palatability. Smoked meats hung in dedicated smokehouses, the smoking process carefully controlled with specific woods chosen for their flavoring properties. Elite pantries before winter were impressive sights. Shelves lined with jars and crocks, barrels of grain and flour, strings of onions and garlic hanging from rafters, dried herbs bundled and labeled, wheels of cheese aging properly, preserved eggs packed in lime or salt. These weren't desperate stockpiles, but abundant reserves, quantities that suggested not just survival, but the maintenance of a lifestyle. Yet for all these advantages, winter pressed upon the elite with its own forms of hardship. The isolation that affected all frontier inhabitants didn't respect social distinctions. When storms closed roads and buried the landscape under snow, even the wealthy found themselves cut off from the networks that supplied their comforts. The last caravan of autumn might arrive in October or November, and after that, no further supplies would come until spring. What had been ordered and stockpiled was all that would be available for the next 4 or 5 months. This created its own anxieties. Had enough been ordered? Would supplies stretch through an unusually long winter? What if certain items ran out, not necessities perhaps, but the small luxuries that made frontier life bearable for those accustomed to them? The prospect of spending January without tea, or February without tobacco, or running out of lamp oil and having to resort to tallow candles like common settlers, these were concerns that might seem trivial compared to starvation or freezing, but they weighed heavily nonetheless. They represented a diminishment of status, a slide toward the conditions of those below them in the social hierarchy. The elite household's relationship to storms themselves was mediated by others. When signs of approaching weather appeared, it was servants who rushed to complete outdoor preparations. It was hired workers who checked the roof, who brought in extra firewood, who secured the animal shelters where horses and livestock waited. The elite might observe this work, might issue instructions or express concerns, but the physical labor and the intimate knowledge of how structures responded to stress belonged to others. This created a curious vulnerability. The elite depended entirely on the competence and loyalty of their servants and workers. If those workers had their own families to protect, and most did, then when a storm approached, priorities could conflict. A servant might complete tasks at the elite household quickly and perhaps less thoroughly than ideal, rushing to return to his own family's needs. A worker might be thorough but resentful, aware that his own children were helping his wife prepare their modest cabin while he secured the windows of someone who would spend the storm in relative comfort. These tensions rarely erupted into open conflict. The economic relationships were too important to jeopardize, and most servants and workers understood that their own winter survival often depended on continued employment. But the tensions existed nonetheless, adding a social dimension to storm preparation that settlers, who relied primarily on their own labor and immediate family, didn't experience in the same way. Inside elite homes during storms, life continued with a semblance of normalcy that would have seemed extraordinary to settlers huddled in single-room cabins. In one room, a fire burned in a proper fireplace with a chimney that drew efficiently, keeping smoke out of living spaces. Candles, real wax candles, provided light for reading or writing. The elite might spend storm days catching up on correspondence, knowing the letters wouldn't be sent until spring, but writing them nonetheless. They read books, sometimes aloud to family members, voices carrying across rooms that remained warm enough to sit in comfort. They played chess or cards, the pieces and cards themselves, often fine things brought from European cities. They maintained routines, meals at regular hours, clothing changed daily, a sense of order imposed against the chaos howling outside. Children in elite households experienced winter storms differently than settler children. They weren't expected to contribute to survival in the same immediate ways. They might fetch things for adults or help with minor tasks, but the burden of preparation and maintenance fell on others. This created different childhood memories, different relationships to winter. Elite children might remember storms as times of closeness with parents who couldn't escape to work, as opportunities for storytelling and games, as periods when normal lessons and expectations relaxed slightly. For settler children, storms meant work, tending fires, caring for younger siblings, helping stretch limited supplies, responsibilities that shaped them into competent adults quickly. Yet even elite children felt the weight of storms. The howling wind frightened them just as it frightened all children. The darkness pressed on them, the sense of being trapped, unable to go outside, unable to see friends or move freely. This affected all young people regardless of their household's resources, and perhaps elite children felt an additional burden, the awareness, however dimly perceived, that their comfort depended on the labor of others who might be suffering more. Servant families living in smaller structures attached to or near the main house experienced storms with fewer buffers than their employers, but more resources than independent settlers. They had access to excess firewood from the main supply. They might receive food from the elite household's abundant stores. Their structures, though modest, were often better built than settler cabins, benefiting from the same skilled construction and quality materials, even if on a smaller scale. But they occupied an uncomfortable middle position, neither fully sharing in elite comfort nor experiencing the fierce independence of settlers who relied only on themselves. Social gatherings sometimes occurred during winter, even during storm periods when multiple elite families might find themselves sheltering together. If a storm approached while guests were visiting, the expectation was that they would remain until it passed. Leaving would be both impractical and potentially fatal. So the elite household expanded to accommodate visitors, creating temporary living arrangements that brought together people who might not ordinarily spend days in close proximity. These forced gatherings could be pleasant, shared meals, conversation, entertainment, but they could also reveal tensions, create conflict, or simply become tedious as days stretched into each other with the same faces, the same conversations, the same careful maintenance of social niceties in cramped circumstances. The elite also faced unique challenges in maintaining their social positions during winter. Status on the frontier was partly about resources, but it was also about performance, the ability to demonstrate through clothing, speech, manners, and lifestyle that one belonged to a different class than the common settlers. Winter made this performance harder. Clothing became purely functional. Even the wealthy bundled into furs and heavy fabrics that obscured the fine tailoring of what lay underneath. The carefully cultivated differences in appearance that marked social distinction in summer largely disappeared under the necessities of winter dress. Hygiene, that marker of civilization, became challenging. Bathing required heating large quantities of water, a resource-intensive process that even the wealthy might limit during the coldest months. Hair, skin, clothing, all suffered from the long months of cold, smoke, and limited washing. The elite might maintain standards longer or better than settlers, but they couldn't entirely escape the leveling effect of winter's demands. There was also the question of purpose. Settlers knew why they were on the frontier: land, opportunity, escape from worse circumstances in European Russia. Their relationship to hardship was direct and comprehensible, but the elite were often there by choice, or at least by acceptance of positions that could have been refused. They traded the comforts of established cities for higher salaries, greater opportunities for advancement, or escape from social failures elsewhere. Winter forced them to confront the reality of that choice. Was the enhanced income worth months of isolation? Was the advancement in rank or position worth the fear that came with each approaching storm? These weren't questions that could be easily answered, and they created a particular kind of psychological burden. The awareness that suffering was in some sense voluntary, chosen, and therefore perhaps meaningless. The elite relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region also took on different dimensions. Where settlers often interacted with the Evenki, Yakut, and other groups as practical equals, trading knowledge, learning survival skills, sometimes intermarrying, the elite maintained more distance. They employed indigenous guides and workers, purchased furs through indigenous trappers, but the relationships were more clearly transactional. There was less opportunity or necessity for the kind of cultural exchange that shaped settler practices. This meant the elite often remained more culturally European even after years on the frontier, maintaining traditions and attitudes from distant cities while living in circumstances those traditions hadn't anticipated. This cultural conservatism sometimes worked against them. Indigenous storm wisdom, which had helped settlers survive, reached the elite only in filtered or partial forms. They might know in general terms that certain sky conditions meant storms were coming, but they lacked the detailed embodied knowledge that settlers acquired through direct teaching and experience. They were cushioned by resources but also isolated by status from information that might have helped them prepare more effectively. When things went wrong, the consequences could be dramatic. A storm that arrived unexpectedly while supplies were low or while servants were away visiting their own families could transform an elite household's advantages into vulnerabilities. The large house required more fuel to heat, and if firewood hadn't been properly staged, previously comfortable rooms could become dangerously cold. Multiple hearths meant multiple fires to maintain, and if there weren't enough people to tend them through the night, some might go out. Glass windows, that marker of civilization, could crack under extreme temperature stress, admitting cold that cheaper hide coverings might have blocked. And the psychological shock of discomfort for those unaccustomed to it could be as debilitating as the physical reality. There are accounts, rare but revealing, of elite families who suffered during storms despite their resources. A merchant family whose main chimney developed a crack during a storm, filling their house with smoke and forcing them to retreat to a single room with a small stove, living for 4 days in conditions barely better than a settler cabin. An official's family whose servant families all fled to their own homes when an unexpected second storm approached, leaving the official and his wife to manage preparations themselves, work they'd never done and didn't fully understand, resulting in a roof partially collapsing under snow weight that should have been cleared days earlier. These failures were usually hushed up, not spoken of widely, because they undermined the social narratives that justified elite status. If the wealthy and educated couldn't protect themselves better than common settlers, what legitimized their advantages? But the stories circulated quietly nonetheless, becoming cautionary tales and sources of some satisfaction for those lower on the social hierarchy. As winter progressed and storms accumulated, the elite faced a particular kind of monotony. Settlers had work, constant, exhausting work that at least provided purpose and structure. The elite, cushioned from the worst physical demands, had time, and time during a Siberian winter could become oppressive. Letters could only be written so many times to recipients who wouldn't receive them for months. Books could be reread, but even the largest personal library held only so many volumes. Conversations recycled the same topics, the same memories, the same complaints and hopes. Days blended together in ways that made tracking time difficult. Was it Tuesday or Wednesday? Had it been 2 weeks since the last storm or 3? This temporal dissolution affected everyone on the frontier, but the elite, with more waking hours not consumed by survival labor, experienced it with particular intensity. Some found productive ways to fill the time. They wrote extensively memoirs, observations of frontier life, technical treatises on trade or governance. They taught their children not just basic literacy, but music, languages, mathematics, history, attempting to recreate European education in the wilderness. They planned for spring and summer, making lists and diagrams and schemes that might or might not prove practical when the weather finally broke. Others struggled more. Alcohol consumption, always a concern in isolated populations, could become problematic for the elite who had better access to supplies of vodka, wine, and spirits. The line between having a drink to pass the evening and drinking to escape awareness of the long, dark hours was thin and easily crossed. And there were darker outcomes, accounts of depression, of strange behaviors, of the psychological unraveling that isolation and monotony could produce even in, perhaps especially in, those who'd prided themselves on their education and self-control. Yet spring would come for the elite as it came for everyone. The first thaw, the first mud, the first possibility of travel and communication with the larger world. The elite often experienced this transition more acutely than settlers. They'd been waiting not just for warmth and light, but for the resumption of social life, for letters from distant places, for the arrival of new supplies ordered the previous year, for confirmation that the world beyond the frontier still existed and they were still connected to it. The first caravans of spring brought mail that had accumulated in distant cities over the winter months. For the elite, these letters were lifelines, news of family, updates on political changes, business correspondence that would shape the coming year's activities. Opening these letters was ritual, often done in company with other elite families who'd gathered to share the occasion. Sometimes the news was welcome, a promotion, a healthy birth in the extended family, successful business transactions. Sometimes it was devastating, deaths, financial failures, shifts in political fortune that meant recall to less desirable positions or worse. The first supply caravans also brought new goods, fresh supplies of the commodities that made elite life possible. Tea, sugar, tobacco, these might have been carefully rationed through the winter, and their arrival meant the restoration of normal consumption. New books arrived, new fabrics, luxury goods that served both practical functions and psychological ones, reminding the elite of who they were or aspired to be. The arrival of these supplies was also a social event, a moment when the elite gathered to see what had come, to trade and share, to reassert their communal identity as distinct from the settlers around them. But spring also brought reckonings. Winter revealed the quality of preparation, the adequacy of resources, the effectiveness of social relationships. Elite families who'd prepared well and maintained good relationships with their servants and workers emerged in good condition. Those who'd been careless or unlucky or who'd let social tensions deteriorate emerged weakened. And sometimes they didn't emerge at all. There are accounts of elite households found silent when spring came, the residents having perished from cold, illness, accident, or the mysterious combination of factors that could transform a fortified house into a tomb. These deaths shocked their communities more than settler deaths did, not because they were objectively more tragic, but because they challenged assumptions. The elite were supposed to be protected by their resources. When they died anyway, it suggested that winter was a force that ultimately couldn't be bought off, couldn't be fully guarded against through wealth or status or careful planning. Storms, in the end, made distinctions that social hierarchies did not. The wind that screamed around an elite mansion screamed with the same voice around a settler's cabin. The cold that seeped through stone foundations seeped through earthen ones just as readily, differing only in degree and timing. The darkness that settled over the landscape pressed on all windows equally, whether glass or hide. And the isolation, the awareness of vulnerability, the basic existential fact of human fragility in the face of winter's power, these touched everyone, regardless of how many candles they could afford to burn. This is not to say that resource differences didn't matter. They mattered profoundly. Elite families were far less likely to starve, freeze, or suffer the worst consequences of inadequate preparation. Their children were less likely to die from winter illnesses, their old and weak more likely to survive. The comfort they experienced, physical warmth, adequate food, the ability to maintain some semblance of normal life, represented real and significant advantages. But these advantages existed within a larger context where winter remained sovereign. The elite could mitigate winter's impact, buffer themselves against its worst effects, maintain dignity and routine in the face of its assault. But they couldn't escape it. couldn't transcend it, couldn't achieve the kind of security that would have allowed them to forget, even briefly, where they were and what season held them in its grip. In this sense, frontier winter created a strange sort of equality. Not an equality of experience. The settler and the official lived very different winters, but an equality of subjection. All were winter's subjects, all lived under its law, all waited for its permission to resume normal life. The social hierarchies that structured frontier society during summer remained intact during winter, but they were revealed as human constructions, provisional and somewhat fragile, sustained by continued effort and prone to disruption. Winter cared nothing for rank or wealth. It tested everyone according to the same basic criteria. Had you prepared adequately? Did your structure hold? Could you maintain fire and hope through the long darkness? Those who failed these tests suffered regardless of their social position. Those who passed them survived, and survival on the winter frontier was its own form of achievement, one that levels even as it preserves distinctions. As we consider these contrasts, the merchant in his book-lined study and the settler in his single-room cabin, both listening to the same storm, both waiting for the same spring, we might reflect on what winter reveals about human society. The structures we build, the hierarchies we maintain, the distinctions we enforce, all of these continue to function during winter, but they're also exposed as contingent, dependent, ultimately secondary to more basic questions of survival and endurance. The elite needed their servants and workers as much as or more than those workers needed employment. The resources that defined elite status had to be prepared, transported, stored, and managed by others. The knowledge that preserved life during winter storms came often from those lowest on the social hierarchy: indigenous people, experienced settlers, servants who'd lived through more winters than their employers. Winter, then, didn't so much eliminate social hierarchies as reveal their basis in mutual dependence and the limits of what any position could provide. And perhaps there's something quietly democratic in this. The way winter treated the frontier as a single entity, pressing on all its inhabitants, testing all equally, even while acknowledging that some had better tools for meeting those tests. The storm that buried the settlement in snow didn't inquire about who lived in which structure. The cold that settled over the landscape didn't modulate its severity based on property lines or social status. Everyone woke to the same grey light, everyone heard the same wind, everyone felt the same underlying truth, that they were small, vulnerable, and dependent on preparations made months earlier and choices made in moments now past. In this shared vulnerability, there was perhaps a kind of community, one that cross-cut the social divisions that organized frontier life during easier seasons. Not that the divisions disappeared, they didn't, but that they became less absolute, less defining. The elite who treated their servants dismissively during summer might find themselves dependent on those same servants' knowledge when winter storms approached. The settler who'd resented elite privilege might find that privilege offered no escape from the fear that came with each approaching storm. And in these moments of recognition, however brief or incomplete, the frontier population glimpsed a common humanity, a shared condition that winter imposed and that no amount of resources or status could fully overcome. This is not a comfortable truth, and perhaps that's why it's rarely recorded in official documents or elite memoirs. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge the limits of power, the incompleteness of security, the ways that human pretensions to control and distinction exist only within narrow parameters that nature, in the form of winter storms, periodically erased, or at least severely challenged. But the truth persists nonetheless, written not in documents, but in the landscape itself, in the ruins of elite mansions that fell to winter, just as settler cabins did, in the anonymous graves where social rank meant nothing, in the shared memory of those who survived and who understood, however they expressed it, that winter had taught them something about what mattered and what didn't, about what could be relied upon and what was revealed as temporary, contingent, and ultimately unable to protect against the deepest cold. We have traveled together through the long hours of preparation and waiting, through the stories of those who endured, and the mysteries they left behind, through the contrasts of privilege and poverty that winter both preserved and challenged. Now, as our journey through these frozen landscapes draws to a close, let us rest a moment and reflect on what these distant struggles might whisper to us across the centuries. The settlers who stuffed moss into cabin walls and counted their firewood pieces with anxious care are gone now. The elite who maintained their book collections and rationed their imported tea are gone as well. The storms they prepared for have long since blown themselves out, leaving no trace except in the weathered wood of ruins and the faint impressions in historical records. Yet something of their experience persists, something worth carrying forward into our own comfort. They knew things we have largely forgotten. They knew that survival required attention, not dramatic gestures or heroic moments, but the steady accumulation of small, careful actions repeated with consistency. They knew that preparation was a form of care, both for oneself and for those who depended on you. They knew that winter would come regardless of wishes or fears, and that the only reasonable response was to meet it with whatever resources and knowledge one possessed. They understood, too, the limits of control. No amount of preparation guaranteed survival. Roofs could collapse despite reinforcement. Fires could go out despite careful tending. Illness could strike the most prepared household. Storms could exceed all predictions and preparations. In the face of this uncertainty, they prepared anyway, not because preparation ensured success, but because it was what could be done, and doing what could be done was how one maintained dignity and hope in circumstances that offered no guarantees. There was a kind of wisdom in this, a philosophical stance toward life that we, in our climate-controlled homes with our reliable power grids and our emergency services, have less occasion to develop. We have succeeded largely in insulating ourselves from the kind of elemental vulnerability that shaped frontier existence. This is an achievement worth celebrating. Fewer people die from exposure, fewer children lose parents to winter storms, fewer families face the stark choice between freezing and burning their furniture. But perhaps we've lost something too, or at least let it atrophy, the capacity to sit with uncertainty while taking meaningful action, the knowledge that comfort is contingent and precious, the awareness that human life exists within larger systems, weather, seasons, natural cycles, that continue regardless of our preferences. The understanding that community isn't just a pleasant social arrangement but a practical necessity, that we depend on each other in ways both obvious and subtle. Consider the quietness of their preparation. There was no panic in how Marta reinforced her cabin or helped her neighbors. There was no drama in the settlers' methodical transfer of firewood from outside stack to interior wall. There was simply work, done steadily, done completely, done with the full awareness of its importance. In our age of constant stimulation and manufactured urgency, there's something almost revolutionary about this calm purposefulness, this ability to do what needs doing without emotional amplification or performative stress. Consider, too, the way they held knowledge. Storm reading wasn't learned from books but from observation, from teaching, from the slow accumulation of experience. It was embodied knowledge, felt in the sinuses and joints, perceived through changes too subtle for instruments to measure. This kind of knowing is increasingly rare in our data-rich world, yet it represents something fundamental about human capability, our ability to attune ourselves to our environment, to develop senses we didn't know we possessed, to become, through attention and practice, competent in ways that can't be quickly transmitted or easily explained. The mysteries we encountered, the carved symbols and protective whistles, the ritual practices and underground chambers, speak to another dimension of frontier experience that our modern categories sometimes struggle to accommodate. These people lived in a world where the practical and the spiritual weren't rigidly separated, where ensuring physical survival and maintaining psychological wholeness were understood as related challenges requiring related responses. They carved protection symbols not because they were primitive or superstitious, but because such acts served multiple functions: practical marking, psychological reassurance, social communication, spiritual expression, all at once. We tend to pass these functions into separate categories, but perhaps they understood something we've forgotten about how humans actually work, about how we need to engage with our circumstances on multiple levels simultaneously to maintain our full humanity. And the social dimensions of their experience offer their own quiet lessons. The frontier didn't eliminate inequality. If anything, the harsh conditions made resource differences more consequential. But it did reveal the interdependence that underlies all human social arrangements. The elite needed their servants' knowledge and labor. The settlers needed the markets and networks that elite merchants maintained. The communities needed both practical competence and symbolic leadership, both physical work and social cohesion. Winter made these dependencies visible in ways that more forgiving seasons might obscure. Perhaps there's guidance here for how we might think about our own social arrangements, our own inequalities, our own questions about what we owe each other and why. As you settle deeper into rest now, perhaps pulling your blankets closer or adjusting your pillow, consider for a moment the extraordinary privilege of your comfort. The warmth that surrounds you required no hours of wood gathering, no careful rationing of fuel, no anxious calculation of whether supplies would last. The roof above you doesn't groan under snow weight. The walls around you don't admit needles of freezing air through gaps in the chinking. If you're cold, you adjust a thermostat. If you're hungry, you walk to a kitchen where food waits in refrigerators and cupboards acquired not through months of careful preservation but through a simple trip to a store. This is miraculous, truly. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of being marvelous, extraordinary, almost impossible from the perspective of those frontier families we've been visiting. They would have struggled to imagine the casual comfort in which you rest tonight. The idea that warmth could be summoned with a dial, that light could appear at the flick of a switch, that winter could be reduced to a merely visual phenomenon observed through windows from inside spaces maintained at constant temperature. These would have seemed like fantasies, dreams of paradise. Yet here we are, living in what they would have considered a kind of heaven. And perhaps that recognition can serve us, can remind us that comfort is not natural or inevitable, but the product of accumulated human effort and innovation. The furnace that warms your home, the insulation in your walls, the power grid that delivers electricity, the supply chains that keep stores stocked. All of these represent the work of countless people, the application of knowledge built over generations, the organization of systems vastly more complex than anything the frontier knew. We are not preparing for winter storms in the way those settlers did, but we are beneficiaries of those who prepared the world that makes our comfort possible. And maybe, as you drift towards sleep, you can carry some small appreciation for that. Not guilt. Guilt serves no one, but appreciation, awareness, perhaps a gentle commitment to not take your comfort entirely for granted, to remember occasionally that it rests on foundations both material and social that require maintenance, attention, and the continued willingness of people to do the unglamorous work that keeps systems functioning. The settlers who are the subject of our story didn't think of themselves as heroes, and we shouldn't romanticize them either. They were people caught in circumstances, doing what they could to survive, making choices that ranged from wise to foolish, succeeding and failing in roughly the proportions that humans always do. Some were generous and some were selfish. Some were competent and some were careless. Some built communities that supported each other, and some fostered tensions that made hard times harder. They were, in other words, human, which means they were complicated, contradictory, and only partially aware of the meanings their lives might hold for those looking back across time. But in their ordinary struggles, in their preparations and fears and small victories, they reveal something about the human condition that remains relevant. We are vulnerable creatures, dependent on complex systems we don't fully control, living always with uncertainty about what the future holds. We respond to this vulnerability by preparing, by learning, by creating communities of mutual support, by developing knowledge and passing it forward, by making the best choices we can with the information and resources available to us. And we endure, sometimes barely, sometimes with grace, sometimes with both at different moments. The frontier winter, in its extremity, simply made these basic facts more visible. We face our own storms, different in form but similar in requiring preparation, attention, and the willingness to do what can be done in the face of uncertainty. Our challenges are climate change, social division, technological disruption, the everyday difficulties of making lives work in circumstances that often feel beyond our control. Like the frontier settlers, we can't eliminate these challenges or guarantee outcomes. But we can prepare thoughtfully, learn from experience and from each other, take care of what's within our power to protect, and maintain hope, not as blind optimism, but as commitment to continuing effort. As the narrative of our journey closes, imagine yourself not in that cramped frontier cabin with the storm howling outside, but here, now, in your own bed, your own safety. The wind, if there is wind where you are, doesn't threaten you. The darkness is peaceful rather than dangerous. The night ahead holds not a test of survival, but simply rest, the restorative sleep that your body needs, and that you can take secure in the knowledge that morning will come without requiring anything from you except that you wake to meet it. Feel the weight of your blankets, the softness of your pillow, the comfortable temperature of the air around you. Let your muscles relax, releasing whatever tension they've been holding. Your shoulders can drop, your jaw can unclench, your hands can open. You've prepared for this day's end simply by being here, by making it to this moment, and that's enough. There's nothing more required of you tonight. The settlers we've journeyed with are at rest now too, in the permanent rest that comes at the end of all lives. Their struggles are over, their preparations, successful or not, have long since served their purpose. The storms they feared have blown out and dissipated into air, leaving behind only the stories we tell and the quiet lessons we might draw if we're patient enough to listen. You carry forward something of their experience now, having walked through it in imagination. Not the hardship itself, you're spared that, but perhaps some small measure of perspective on your own comfort, some appreciation for the effort that survival required and still requires, though in different forms, some recognition of the human capacity to endure, and the value of preparation even when outcomes remain uncertain. Let these thoughts settle gently as you settle into sleep. Let the story fade like twilight fading, leaving only a soft impression, a quiet mood, a sense of having traveled somewhere distant and returned safely. The frontier winter exists now only in memory and imagination, but the present moment, your moment, this moment of rest and peace, is real and yours. Tomorrow will bring its own requirements and possibilities, its own small preparations and choices. But tomorrow is not now. Now is for releasing the day, for letting go of effort and attention, for allowing yourself to drift into the restorative darkness that asks nothing of you except that you accept its gift. The storms of history have passed. The storms of tomorrow haven't yet arrived. And in this quiet space between, this gentle, protected present where you rest in comfort and safety, there is only peace, only breath, slowing, only awareness, dimming, only the soft descent into sleep that comes when the day's journey is complete and the mind finally grants permission to let go. May your rest be deep and undisturbed. May you wake refreshed, carrying perhaps some small fragment of this journey with you, not as burden but as quiet knowledge, not as anxiety but as appreciation. May you remember, when you encounter your own storms in whatever form they take, that preparation is possible, that community matters, that knowledge can be learned and passed forward, and that humans have always found ways to endure what seemed unendurable by doing what could be done with care and attention. And may you remember too that comfort, when you have it, is precious, not to be taken for granted but received with gratitude, enjoyed fully, and perhaps shared when the opportunity arises. The settlers prepared their cabins against winter's assault. We prepare our lives against our own uncertainties. The work continues, generation to generation, each doing what they can with what they have. And somehow, collectively, humanity endures. Rest now in that long continuity, that endless human story of challenge and response, of falling and rising, of preparation and endurance. You are part of it, as they were, as all who came before and all who will come after. Your story is different from theirs, but connected nonetheless. Threads in a tapestry too large to see whole but beautiful in its intricate, ongoing creation. Sleep well. The night is gentle, the morning will come, and you are safe. The quiet lessons of winter's passing have been shared, and now they settle into silence, into the peaceful dark where all stories rest until called forth again. Let them rest in you as you rest, becoming part of the deep knowing that lives below words, in the body and breath, in the slow rhythm of a heart beating calmly through the night. Good night, traveler. Thank you for journeying with us through these forgotten corners of history. May your dreams be calm, your sleep be deep, and may you wake to warmth and light, carrying forward some small ember of what we've shared here, a quiet ember that might, when you need it, remind you of your own strength, your own capacity to prepare and endure, your own place in the long human story of meeting winter, in whatever form it comes, with attention, care, and the stubborn, patient hope that has always carried our kind through the darkest seasons into spring. Rest now. All is well. The story is complete.